My name is Kenneth Wallace. I am 73 years old, and until last week, I believed I had a family. We buried my wife Barbara on a gray Tuesday after 45 years of marriage. Before the flowers had even wilted, my children were measuring the house for renovations. They inherited her $30 million empire, the companies, the estates, the penthouses, the cars. I received a dusty envelope. That night, alone in a cheap motel room, I opened it. Inside was an offshore account number and one line in Barbara's handwriting. This is for the man who always loved me truly. When I checked the balance, I realized my children had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. At the reception, Christopher, my eldest, stood by the fireplace laughing with investors like a prince who'd just been crowned. My daughter Melissa's husband, Aaron, paced the study with a laser measure, already planning to knock down walls. My daughter-in-law Rachel drifted through the dining room, flipping over Barbara's antique vases to check their value. Not one of them asked how I was doing. To them, I was furniture, the quiet gardener who'd gotten lucky marrying a visionary. What none of them knew was the truth. 40 years ago, I sold my own thriving logistics firm to save Barbara's family business from bankruptcy. I poured every cent into her company and built its foundation. Then I stepped back and let her shine, because I never needed the spotlight, only her. But watching my children circle the house like vultures, I understood my silence had raised something dangerous. 2 days later came the will reading. The lawyer divided the entire empire, companies, real estate, the fleet, the penthouses, equally between Christopher and Melissa. Then he slid a worn manila envelope across the table to me. Christopher laughed. A dusty envelope. Guess Mom knew you wouldn't know what to do with real money. Melissa added, with fake sympathy, that they'd give me a $1,000 monthly allowance, but I'd need to vacate the master suite by the weekend. My gardening boots, she said, were ruining the new carpets. I said nothing. I tucked the envelope inside my jacket and walked out. 48 hours later, Melissa and Aaron found me in the greenhouse and handed me a 30-day eviction notice, though they made clear they wanted me gone by the weekend for staging photos. I packed a single suitcase, some clothes, my shaving kit, a photograph of Barbara. Christopher watched me leave from the foyer. "Don't forget your keys," he said. I dropped them on the console and walked down the driveway while my children laughed behind me, certain I was a broken old man accepting his fate. That night, in the motel, I opened the envelope properly. Inside, a brass vault key, a security token, and Barbara's note. I always knew what they were becoming. I just didn't want to believe it. The shell is theirs, but the soul is yours. On the back was a login, a routing code, and a phone number for a Mr. Reynolds. I logged in with trembling hands. What I found wasn't a hidden retirement account. It was the parent holding trust, the real architecture of our empire. Barbara had legally separated the operational company from everything that gave it value: the patents, the real estate, the corporate headquarters, $150 million in liquid assets. Christopher and Melissa had inherited a shell, desks, payroll, a brand name, while I held every deed, every patent, and the power to collapse the whole structure with a signature. They were, without knowing it, my tenants. The next morning I tried to withdraw cash for breakfast. My card was declined. Christopher, now executor of the operational estate, had frozen my personal accounts, hoping hunger would send me crawling back for that humiliating $1,000. I snapped the card in half and called Mr. Reynolds instead. He'd been waiting for my call. Barbara, he explained, had structured the trust precisely because she feared this. A car was already on its way. His office was buried beneath an unmarked building in the financial district, the kind of place where real power doesn't advertise itself. He laid it out plainly. My children owed the parent trust massive licensing fees and back rent that Barbara had always quietly forgiven. Those debts were still legally binding. If called in, their company would be bankrupt within a month. Reynolds also told me something I hadn't known, that Barbara had suspected Rachel and Aaron were siphoning company funds to finance yachts and reckless real estate speculation, and that Christopher and Melissa were either blind to it or complicit. The envelope had been her final test. Treat their father with basic decency, and I'd have brought them into the fold. cast him out, and they'd condemn themselves. Reynolds's strategy was patience. We wouldn't strike outright. We'd send a routine notice of default, disguised as bureaucratic paperwork, and let their arrogance do the rest. While I plotted quietly, my children were building castles on sand. Christopher put up the corporate headquarters, a building he didn't actually own, as collateral for a $50 million personal credit line, signing a personal guarantee without blinking. Melissa put a 7-figure down payment on a luxury yacht using the company card. Rachel went on a shopping spree, with corporate funds like the well was bottomless. The notice of default arrived on Christopher's desk days later. He barely glanced at it, dismissed it as clerical nonsense, and buried it in a mail tray. By ignoring it, they forfeited their legal grace period and formally defaulted, without knowing it. Reynolds and I toasted with sparkling water. The trap had closed. 3 days later, it detonated. Christopher's banker called to say a title search revealed the company owned neither the headquarters nor the patents backing his loan. The credit line was frozen instantly. Melissa's cards were declined mid-shopping spree. Her yacht deal collapsed. Corporate accounts locked down company-wide. Panicked, the four of them regrouped, and Aaron proposed something reckless, quietly liquidating company vehicles and servers to a private buyer, routing the cash into personal accounts to cover their debts. It was blatant embezzlement. Rachel talked Christopher into it, warning that public humiliation was worse than a little creative accounting. He authorized it. Every transaction was silently mirrored straight to my parent trust. They were, without realizing it, documenting their own crimes. I dressed the part they expected, old flannel, worn boots, and walked into the lobby of the headquarters begging Christopher for the allowance he'd promised. He didn't lower his voice. He raised it, mocking me in front of his own staff, calling me a glorified gardener who'd ridden his mother's coattails before having security throw me out onto the sidewalk. I'd recorded every word. Desperate for cash, Christopher and Aaron found a buyer, an overseas syndicate offering 30 cents on the dollar for the headquarters. No due diligence, cash within 24 hours. It was Reynolds's trap, fully disguised. In a windowless basement office, a man named Reed slid over a stack of documents. Buried in the legal language were carefully worded confessions, admissions of commingled funds, unauthorized asset liquidation, and explicit acknowledgement of my trust's superior claim. Christopher signed. Melissa signed beneath him, barely reading a word. They believed they'd secured a lifeline. They had, in fact, signed their own indictment. The next morning, 10 forensic auditors arrived at the headquarters with a legal mandate to seize every ledger, server, and record in the building. Christopher, certain this was a tax audit, barricaded himself and the others in the executive suite and fed hours of incriminating paperwork into an industrial shredder, never realizing every document was already backed up digitally. He wasn't destroying evidence. He was committing a new felony in real time. Still delusional, Christopher summoned his hand-picked board and invited journalists to the building, planning to spin the audit as his own bold restructuring and secure himself and Melissa $20 million golden parachute packages before anyone could stop him. Melissa lied to the board, claiming the company had never been more liquid. Pens hovered over the contracts. That's when the doors opened. I walked in wearing the bespoke Milan suit Barbara had commissioned years earlier. No longer the broken man from the lobby. Beside me stood Mr. Reynolds with a stack of crimson folders, and the lead forensic auditor with her team. Christopher ordered security to drag me out again. Reynolds calmly informed the guards that touching me would mean assault against the building's legal owner. They stepped back. Reynolds dropped the folders on the table with a boom that silenced the room and laid it out for everyone. The board, the journalists watching through the glass. The operational shell owed the parent trust $15 million in unpaid licensing fees and rent. It was in catastrophic default. Every patent, every piece of software, the building itself, none of it belonged to Christopher or Melissa. It belonged to the man they'd evicted, frozen out, and mocked in his own lobby. I told them the truth they'd never known, that I was the one who liquidated my own company 40 years ago to save their mother's business from ruin, that I chose the shadows so she could have the light, and that Barbara had left me that dusty envelope not as an insult, but as a final test. If they'd shown me an ounce of decency, I would have shared everything. Instead, they'd proven exactly what she feared. The board dropped the golden parachute contracts like they were radioactive. Rachel and Aaron began inching toward the exits. Then Aaron, flipping through the syndicate contract in a panic, realized what they'd actually signed: a legal confession to fraud, embezzlement, and an explicit waiver of any severance rights. The alliance shattered instantly. Rachel accused Christopher of hiding the company's true condition. Aaron threw Melissa under the bus, claiming he'd only been following orders. Melissa attacked Aaron in tears. Christopher sat frozen, watching his empire and his family disintegrate in the same breath. I had Reynolds place a final eviction notice in front of them: 24 hours to vacate the premises, personal items only, corporate devices and files to remain. Christopher begged to know where they'd go. I told him what he'd never once asked me. I told him survival isn't inherited, it's earned. Then I walked out, leaving the guards who'd once thrown me into the street to escort my children out instead. What followed was swift. Every personal guarantee they'd signed came due. Tow trucks arrived at Christopher's estate to repossess his cars, while Rachel packed her bags upstairs, handing him divorce papers on her way out the door without a backward glance. Melissa's yacht was seized at the dock. Aaron filed for divorce from a rented penthouse rather than risk being financially tied to her fraud charges. Their wealthy friends stopped answering calls. Within a week, my 2 children, who had once measured my house for renovations before I'd even left the funeral, were standing on the street with nothing. They came to the estate gates a few weeks later, unrecognizable in second-hand clothes, begging to be let in. Christopher wept, saying they had nothing left. Melissa pressed her face to the iron bars and asked, finally, for the very $1,000 allowance they'd once dangled in front of me, as a bribe to disappear quietly. I looked at them and felt no anger, only a hollow, absolute emptiness where my love for them used to live. I told them that money offered without love isn't generosity, it's a bribe to erase someone. I reminded them that 40 years ago, their mother and I built everything from nothing but our own hands and our trust in each other. It was time they learned to do the same. I turned and walked back up the driveway, leaving them at the gates they'd once ordered me to vacate, and didn't look back. Family isn't blood. It's built through respect, loyalty, and a love that never asks for a return on investment. I learned, the hardest way possible, that setting a boundary isn't cruelty, it's survival. Sometimes you have to walk away from the people you love most, to save yourself from who they chose to become.